Vorrh by Brian Catling. I'm just kidding, don't worry. The Vorrh with a V by Brian Catling, the novel that Alan Moore has called phosphorescent. I know what the word means. I still don't know what he meant by that word after reading all 500 pages of this book. This is a novel I both despise and enjoyed. And in fact, I dedicated an entire read-along to this book. So if you would like to check out all 9 episodes of that epic, check out the card up in the corner and you can read along with me. So what is the hook? What is the Vorrh about? A vast and mysterious forest located in Africa called the Vorrh draws Europeans during the early 1900s to do what Europeans do: occupy it, strip it of resources. They assemble a town called Essenwald at its border to do just that. And amid the industrialization, a man ventures into that forest with a bow made of his dead wife. An African native follows him, seeking revenge. A strange boy raised by automatons is educated in a basement of an abandoned house. These are just a few of the characters that populate the narrative of the Vorrh. So what did I think? Well, let us begin with character. This novel has a lot of characters. I'm not a big fan of a big cast of characters because, POV characters that is, because I don't feel like we're ever given enough time to get to know these people, right? I love reading novels for character. I love getting in their heads, understanding them, hating them, loving them, whatever it is. And even after 500 pages, that was not enough time for me. These characters often felt like they were treading water, going absolutely nowhere. Their arcs, if you want to call them arcs at all, completely fizzled out. And I will talk briefly about a few of the main players in this story, what I liked about them, what I didn't like about them. And let us begin with Peter Williams. He was a British soldier, and he turned into what someone might call a mythic figure in this book. He's the man who fashioned the bow out of the remains of his wife, and he shoots an arrow off into that forest and follows it. Why? We don't quite know. But his tale is kind of peppered throughout this, right? I thought he was going to be the guiding light, right? He was going to be the central figure in this. To a degree, he kind of is, but structurally and from a ratio perspective in this novel, it didn't quite line up that way. And so while he is mysterious, he is stoic, he's kind of the most fantasy character in this entire book. And this is not your typical epic fantasy, high fantasy, sword and sorcery. This is all grounded in reality. This is what you might call an alternate history even. It takes place in the early 1900s. Primarily in Africa, where this crazy forest is. But as much as I liked Peter Williams, his story, as many of them, fizzled out. Now we have Sungali, a man who is following him. He's an African native. He knew Peter Williams when he was a soldier before he became this mythic figure. And what I like about Sungali is that he's kind of torn in a way. I guess I shouldn't say torn. He knows exactly what he wants to do. He has a very solid motivation, although I guess he kind of does forget it somewhere in the novel, or he second guesses himself. But on one hand, he was going to do something bad. And on the other hand, he's getting revenge. And those two are tightly intertwined, which makes us as the reader far more interested in this character. So I think Sungali was an interesting character for the most part. However, just like Mr. Williams, his story kind of takes a dump at the end, right? It completely fizzled out. And I'll probably say fizzled out quite often in this because that's how this book left me, honestly. We have another character named Ishmael. He's the boy who exists in this basement of this strange house in Essenwald, and he's raised by these automatons, these little robotic kind of characters. And his story is probably the most interesting until it isn't. I loved how he started out, but then once this other character, whose name is Gertrude, quote unquote rescues him, right? I felt like their whole storyline at the beginning anyway felt like a commentary on colonialism. You know, she comes in trying to save him, right, from his shitty environment, being in this dark basement with these robots, and to civilize him essentially. That of course backfires, and he's of course very happy where he is, at least he thinks he is. The strange thing about Ishmael though is he's a very bipolar person. You could argue that he's a young man, so he's got raging hormones, and oh boy, there's a lot of raging hormones in this book, so get ready for that. But I never felt like his actions were motivated in a logical way. And I don't mean like him coming to a logical conclusion as to, hey, I'm acting logically, but just his actions never felt justified, even in a obtuse way, if that makes sense. I'm probably not articulating myself very well. But when you're reading a book, when you're watching a movie, when a story progresses, when these characters progress through a narrative, there's believability in their actions. You can understand why they may be doing something versus something else. It doesn't always have to make sense, but There has to be an element in the story, maybe a reaction, maybe something they experience, something that informs that. Anyway, I felt like Ishmael's actions from the beginning of the novel to the end of the novel were just all over the place. And you'll see that through many characters in this book, where you'll think you know them and they take a hard right, but it doesn't feel like it was purposeful. It felt like Brian Catling just didn't know how to explore character, how to make them feel alive, make them feel real. And that's unfortunate because, again, like I said, it's strange. They're extremely colorful. They're extremely unique. They're extremely interesting. But as real people, they fall flat. They never felt real. Everybody in this novel did not feel authentic to me. It felt like they were puppets for Catling. To serve the story, well, I shouldn't say serve the story, to serve the setting, because the setting seems to be the most important thing that Catling was trying to create with the Vorrh. Another thing you may find interesting or not, depending on where you stand, is Catling takes people from history, real people. So we have Edward Muybridge, who is the man who captured the first moving image of a man riding a horse. And we also have Raymond Roussel, who was a French poet. Muybridge's story is probably the biggest stinker of this entire novel because whereas a lot of these characters are kind of, their paths are intertwining, they're crossing. Not all of them, but they feel like they're inhabiting the same world. Muybridge feels like he exists in another book somewhere. He never crosses paths with anybody in this book. And it just felt weird. I was left wondering, why does this character exist? Why is he here? What is Catling trying to say? You might say he was trying to make a statement by what Muybridge was doing, the inventions he was making, metaphors for vision and optics. I have no idea, but it doesn't matter because stories should have those things. They should have subtext. They should have metaphor. There should be foreshadowing. All of these great things that exist below the surface. But you still need a story. You still need some kind of story. All of those things I mentioned should not be the only thing you're left with. And that is unfortunately what we have here. But I will leave you with this. If you are still interested in reading this book, after 500 pages, these characters really absolutely go nowhere. All right, let us talk about the plot next. Something I'm still struggling to find. There doesn't seem to be much of a plot in this book, and I could have appreciated that from an anthology perspective. So a book that I absolutely loved called Knock 'em Stiff is a story like that. It's a collection of stories with people coexisting in the same location. Sometimes their paths cross, sometimes they don't, but there's this just overarching theme, right? So when you get to the end, even though you're reading what almost feels like a short story collection, it feels connected. You understand what the writer was trying to do, what he was trying to communicate. This novel kind of feels like that because we have many characters. Sometimes their paths cross, sometimes they don't. They seem to be driving the plot. There doesn't seem to be like some, big master plot that exists outside of them that they are reacting to. They're driving it forward, which I can appreciate. I love a character-driven plot. Unfortunately, it doesn't amount to anything. That's the biggest failing with this novel is, again, we have all these threads. We have all these interesting threads, you can argue, that just never come together. I felt like I read a third of a novel, and I'm wondering if we honestly don't get any kind of conclusion to this story or these characters until the third novel. And if so, that's a terrible, terrible thing. I think that when you break apart a series, yes, you don't need to explain everything. You shouldn't explain everything in the first book of a trilogy in this case, but give me something. Give me some kind of ending. Yes, lead into the next book. Totally fine. Just give me something, goddammit. Catling was a poet. Catling was an artist. He was clearly interested in mythological stories and history. And this novel really just feels like a collection of ideas. It doesn't feel like anything cohesive. It feels like a sketchbook rather than a complete narrative. And I could almost appreciate if this novel, the whole point of this novel was that reality is brutal. It's unpredictable. Things don't necessarily end up the way we think they're going to. Subverting expectations. I'm totally all for it, but I don't think that Catling was trying to do that here. There was no resonance right at the end of the story that made you go, oh, I see the point of this. So I can confidently say that Catling was not playing with that theme here. But because Catling wasn't a novelist originally, he just kind of liked to have these ideas run wild in his head, off onto the page. I think that's part of the problem because any classically trained novelist or someone who's been writing novels for a long time, you just kind of feel structure. You feel character arcs. You feel the ebb and flow of these things. You feel how they all work together. The only thing that worked together in this book were the weird characters in the weird setting. I think that worked, and I can appreciate from a historical standpoint, all of the things that Catling did here. Again, I'm not a huge fan of bringing real people into fictional tales. I don't really get the point. But even then, he did breathe some unique life into these characters who I absolutely knew very little about. Let us talk about the writing itself, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. As I mentioned, Catling was a poet, and it shows. At times, the writing in this novel can be extremely beautiful. There were lines that I just basked in, one might say. But at other times, it's very heavy in exposition. And again, I feel like this really goes back to what I was saying earlier about Catling had not written any novels, to my knowledge, before this. He has not studied as a writer of novels, long-form storytelling. Yes, I'm sure he told plenty of beautiful stories with beautiful words with his poetry, but long-form fiction is a very different thing. And just like he was unable to understand plot and character, he was not good at balancing exposition and immediate action in fiction. Most of a novel should be immediate action. Should be like watching a film. Like we're down there with the characters, seeing the world, experiencing what they experience. Use exposition sparingly. You want to use it when you want to glaze over some information. Maybe the reader needs to know something about the world, about the character that isn't extremely important, but informs something. And the best exposition, to me, comes from introspection. It comes from character. It's not like an omniscient voice telling us something about the world. It emerges from character, because you can play with the figurative camera distance all you want, and plenty of writers do. But I think the most effective storytelling comes from keeping the camera as close as possible. But beyond having too much exposition versus immediate action, there's also another failing. And that failing is when to use exposition versus immediate action. One scene comes to mind. It's with Ishmael. I won't spoil anything for you, but he has feelings for a young lady, right? They're blossoming love with each other, and she feels for him as well. They're kind of lost in each other's eyes, so to speak. And this is all told to us in about a paragraph or two. Told to us, reported to us, information, exposition. There are many scenes in the book that are like this that would have been better served for immediate action. We could have seen the beat by beat, second by second spilling of Ishmael's emotions, of this other girl's emotions, from a tight POV that would allow us to understand the character, to feel for them. But because all of this was reported to us as information, I didn't feel it. I didn't care. I wasn't invested. Fiction is not about information. It's about emotion. Yes, you need information in fiction, but that information should be given to the reader through character experience, right? Not always chunks of information like you're reading a history book, which is why the writing, as beautiful as it can be at times, is completely uneven. It's completely inconsistent. And Catling just doesn't seem to really grasp how to use the virtual camera of literature. When to pull it back, when to push it in, when to obscure it, when to change the angle, how to frame the scene effectively, which is why I'm going to give The Vorrh by Brian Catling a 5 out of 10. An incredibly rich setting with incredibly colorful characters whose stories unfortunately completely fizzle out. Writing that is both beautiful and frustrating at times, with a story that absolutely goes nowhere. Catling seemed far more interested in giving us information about weaving elements from history, from myth, into a story than he was telling us a story. Well, that is the review. I hope you enjoyed it. Did you read The Vorrh? Let me know below if you loved it, if you hated it. Am I completely wrong? Am I missing something? And if you would like to see my own creative work, the novels I've written, check out the link in the description. Thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for watching. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.